Montana Territory, August 1871. The town of Elkhorn was too quiet for a Tuesday, and that kind of silence meant something was wrong. Brenner Rhoades swung down from his horse, dust coating his boots and the cuffs of his shirt. He had been driving cattle east of the Bitterroot Mountains, and word reached him through a ranch hand that something was happening in town, something about a widow and an auction. He tied his gelding to the hitching post and stepped onto the boardwalk, his jaw tight. The crowd outside the livery stable wasn't there for horses. They were there for her. Odella Emery stood on a wooden crate, arms stiff at her sides, chin high despite the flush in her cheeks. Her black dress was worn but clean, and her hair, the color of chestnut bark, was pinned tight under a bonnet. Her eyes didn't flinch, not even when the man beside her, Sheriff Cullen, raised his voice. "We all know the rules. Widow or not, her debts have to be paid. Her husband died without a will or kin, and she's got no legal claim to the property. She's being offered as a bond wife. That's the law in this territory. Final say goes to the highest bid." "Final say?" Brenner asked, stepping forward. "She ain't livestock." The sheriff turned. "You got a bid, Rhoades?" Brenner looked at Odella. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just stood there, stiff in her grief, her eyes full of fire and humiliation. That was enough. "I do," he said. $100. Cash." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few men cursed. One of them, a rail worker with whiskey on his breath, spat near Brenner's boot. The sheriff paused, looked around. No one outbid. "Done," he said flatly. "She's yours." Odella stepped down without a word. She moved like a woman who had been holding herself up for too long. Her hands trembled, just barely, as she adjusted her skirt. Brenner took off his hat. "Miss Emery, Mrs. Emery," she corrected, voice quiet but firm. "At least for a few more hours." He nodded once. "Then I guess I should say this properly. You'll be my wife now." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, not yet trust, but something that steadied her. They walked away from the crowd in silence. Brenner led her to his horse, untied the reins, and helped her into the saddle. She sat side saddle with practiced ease, hands folded in her lap like she had done this before. He rode beside her, leading the horse slowly toward his homestead, 5 miles west of town. "You did not have to do that," she said finally. "I know. I would have survived. Maybe. But you shouldn't have had to." She looked at him then, long and careful. "Why did you?" Brenner guided his horse around a bend in the trail. "Because I do not like men who look at women like they are something to own. And because you were standing too proud to ask for help, and that told me you needed it worse than anyone." They rode the rest of the way without speaking. Brenner's cabin was small but well built. He had added a second room the year before, thinking he might need it someday. He helped her down from the saddle, then opened the door. "You can sleep in there," he said, gesturing toward the second room. "I will stay out here until we figure things out. I do not need charity. It is not charity. It is decency." She looked away, but something in her posture eased. She stepped inside without another word. By morning, she had scrubbed the hearth, straightened the chairs, and boiled water for coffee. She moved like she still lived under someone else's roof, careful not to touch too much. Brenner watched her from the porch, his coffee mug warm in his hands. "You do not have to clean," he said. "I need to do something," she replied. "I have not done anything in 3 weeks, but bury my husband and stand still while the law stripped my name from his land." Brenner set his mug down. "You said his land. Did you build it with him?" "I planted every seed. I kept the books. I delivered our son in that cabin with my own hands." Brenner's breath caught. "You had a child?" She nodded once. "His name was Finley. He died last winter. Fever. He was 5. The words hung there, heavy and still. "I am sorry," Brenner said. Her eyes met his. "So am I." That night, he heard her crying through the wall. Not loud, not wild, just quiet sobs into a pillow. He sat on the porch until the stars turned cold, then went back inside and stoked the fire. By the 3rd day, she had unpacked her things into the spare room. A Bible, a comb with missing teeth, a folded shirt that must have belonged to her husband. Brenner came in from splitting wood and found her standing by the table, staring at it. "I can leave in the morning," she said softly. "You did what you had to. I do not expect more." He stepped closer. "You do not have to go. I do not belong here. You do not belong anywhere. They would auction you off like a mule." She looked up, startled. You could have had anyone. Why me? Because you were not looking to be saved. You were surviving anyway. Her breath hitched. She looked at him, really looked, and something in her face cracked open. I do not know how to be a wife again, she whispered. I am not asking you to be. He reached out, slow, and took her hand. She did not pull away. That night, he made stew thick with carrots and potatoes, and they ate by the fire. She laughed once, just once, when he spilled salt across the table. He grinned, and that sound stayed with him long after the fire burned low. By the end of the week, she stopped flinching when he entered a room. She started humming when she swept the floor. He brought her wildflowers from the ridge, and she set them in a chipped jar on the table. You do not have to keep pretending this is something it is not, she told him one evening. I am not pretending, he said. You are my wife now. Not because I paid for it. Because I want it to be real. She stared at the fire. That kind of feeling does not happen after 7 days. Then I will wait 87, he said. Or however many it takes. She looked at him, eyes wet, and did not speak again that night. But the next morning, when he came in from tending the fence, he found her in the kitchen making biscuits. She had braided her hair back, and she looked up at him with something soft in her eyes. We are out of salt, she said. I will go into town, he replied, grinning. Anything else you need? She paused, brushed flour from her wrist, then said, just come back. He did, and he always would. The mornings came earlier in August, with the sun cresting low over the pine ridge and spilling gold into the cabin before the rooster ever stirred. Odella stood at the stove, working cornmeal into a batter, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hands moved without thought, steady and sure, but her mind moved elsewhere. Brenner came in from the barn, carrying a bucket half full with milk, his boots tracking the dew from the grass. You sleep any? He asked, setting the pail down near the door. I close my eyes, she said, not turning from the skillet. He hung his hat on the nail beside the door. That ain't what I asked. She scraped a spoon against the cast iron, then finally looked over. I heard a coyote last night. Too close to the north fence. I'll run a wire there this afternoon. They won't keep circling if they get one shock. She nodded once, then turned back to the pan. The cakes were browning. You want to ride out with me today? She hesitated. Where to? Up past the south ridge. I've got a calf limping. Might be a stone caught in the hoof. If you've got an eye for it, I'd welcome the help. She glanced over her shoulder, not quite smiling. I've pulled stones from worse places. They rode out after breakfast, her side saddle on the older mare he kept for guests. The trail unwound through pine and wind-shaped rock, the air still warm but touched with that dry crispness that hinted at fall. Brenner didn't speak much, but he watched her now and then, how she scanned the horizon, how she leaned into the turns like someone long used to balancing on uneven ground. At the far pasture, the calf stood near the edge of the fence line, favoring one leg. Odella dismounted first, lifting her skirt just enough to keep the hem from catching on the grass. She knelt beside the animal without waiting for instruction, her fingers gentle as she tested the leg. Stone, she said after a moment. Deep in the frog. Give me your knife. He passed it over, handle first. She worked the blade in careful arcs, murmuring something low to the calf that Brenner couldn't hear. When the stone came free, she showed it to him, dark, sharp, the size of a walnut. You did that like you've raised stock your whole life, he said. My father bred mules in Kansas. Before the war, I could saddle one before I could spell my name. He lifted a brow. Kansas, huh? Lynn County. We left after the crops failed. Ended up in Wyoming for a while, then the Dakotas. My husband brought me here. She didn't say his name, and Brenner didn't ask. They rode back slower, the sun higher now, with birdsong threading through the trees. You don't seem afraid of being out here, he said after a stretch of silence. I'm not. Most folks who've lost as much as you have, they flinch at wind. I got tired of flinching, she said. Doesn't stop the wind. Back at the cabin, she went to lay out the herbs she'd gathered on the way: wild mint, 2 sprigs of yarrow, and a few strands of Indian tobacco. She worked at the table with a mortar and pestle, not looking up as she spoke. Your cabin's built tight. You make it yourself. I had help with the frame. The roof I did alone. Took 1 full summer. She glanced over. And the second room. I built it thinking I might need it. Didn't know how or when. Just seemed right. She nodded once, as though confirming something to herself. That evening, after the sun went down, She joined him outside on the porch. The sky was pale with stars, the air carrying the faint scent of pine sap and cooling earth. "I've been thinking," she said, arms folded, eyes on the slope beyond the pasture. "I don't want to go back to town for annulment papers." He turned toward her, slow. "You sure? I don't want to be passed from man to man like a ledger account. What happened back there, it wasn't marriage, not really. But this," she paused, her voice quieter now, "this could be. If we make it." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down, took her hand, rough palm to rough palm. "We build slow," he said. "We build right." She didn't pull away. Inside, a candle burned low on the table, casting thin shadows. Odella stepped in first, her gait even, her back unbent. Later that night, when the wind came up through the trees and rattled the shutters, she didn't stir. She slept with her hand resting on the quilt, and when Brenner passed by to bank the fire, he paused just long enough to watch the slow rise and fall of her breath. Then he turned, quiet as dusk, and let her rest. The first frost came early that year, leaving a pale crust on the fence rails and turning the grass brittle beneath their boots. Odella woke before the rooster, pulling her shawl tighter as she stepped outside to check the coop. The hens were quiet, feathers puffed from the cold. Inside, Brenner was already at the stove, coaxing the fire higher. He didn't speak until she returned, rubbing her hands for warmth. "You ever done winter in these mountains?" he asked, eyes on the flame. "No," she said, settling on the bench near the hearth. "Closest was a year in Cheyenne. Wind near took the house off its foundation. Ain't much kinder here. Snow'll stack against the door if we don't dig out daily. You'll need wool-lined boots. I've got a pair my sister left, might fit." Odella nodded, then looked toward the window. The glass had fogged, and beyond it the pasture lay still beneath the pale sky. "Hard to believe it's nearly September. Time moves quiet out here. Hard to keep track unless you're watching the cattle grow." She glanced at him, or watching the firewood pile shrink. He gave a low sound that might have been agreement, and reached for the kettle. The silence between them had changed, no longer edged with caution. It had weight now, and a kind of ease. That afternoon, they worked side by side repairing the barn wall where a plank had split from rain swelling the wood. Odella held the brace while Brenner hammered. Her hands were red from the chill, but she never asked to stop. "You always this stubborn?" he asked, pausing to wipe his brow with his sleeve. "I don't see it as stubborn," she said. "I see it as capable." He looked over at her, the corner of his mouth lifting not with humor, but something close to respect. "Fair enough." She stepped back to inspect the board. "That'll hold through winter? Long as we don't get a wind that tears the roof off. Then I'll sleep with one ear open." That evening, Brenner brought in a bundle of kindling, and she was already at the table stitching a patch over the elbow of one of his shirts. She didn't ask if she should. She simply began. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked without lifting her eyes from the needle. He shook the snow from his shoulders and set the wood in its place. "No. I used to." Her hands paused. "Thought there'd be more beyond the plains. But every road we followed just led to another empty stretch." He sat opposite her, watching the firelight catch the curve of her cheek. "You think this place is empty?" She met his gaze. "No, I don't." Later, when the wind picked up and the trees outside groaned under its force, she set her sewing aside and stood near the window, arms folded tight. "You ever lose anything in a storm?" she asked, voice low. "My father," Brenner said. "Flash flood took him and the wagon. I was 16. She turned slowly. "I didn't know. I don't talk about it much." She crossed the room, each step deliberate. "I'm not good at talking either." "You don't have to be." He reached out, not sudden, just sure, and his fingers brushed hers. She didn't flinch. Her hand settled against his, and they stood like that as the storm pressed against the walls, the cabin holding firm around them. When the lantern burned low, she didn't return to her room. She stayed by the fire while he laid 2 quilts on the floorboards. They slept there, not touching, but close enough to feel the shared warmth. And in the morning, when the wind had gone quiet and the snow laid soft across the fields, she stirred the coals back to life while he stepped outside to check the roof. They didn't speak of the night. They didn't need to. By the end of the week, she started keeping a list of dry goods they'd need before the pass iced over. She wrote it in the corner of an old ledger book and handed it to him without comment. He added horseshoe nails and rifle cartridges, then tucked it in his coat pocket. Before he left for town, she handed him a scarf she'd found in a trunk upstairs. It was worn at the edges, but clean. "Tie it around your neck," she said. "The wind cuts harder down near the river." He paused, then folded it once and looped it just as she'd told him. "You always look out for others like this?" "Only the ones I want coming back." He didn't answer. He just touched the edge of the scarf, then mounted up. When he returned, the sun was low and the horse was damp with sweat. She met him at the door, and he handed over the sack of flour first, then the tin of coffee beans. Only after she'd set them down did he hold out a smaller bundle. She opened it and stared for a long moment. It was a new needle case, hand-stitched, with a bit of blue cotton on the outside. "I saw it in the mercantile," he said. "Figured you'd know what to do with it." Her fingers closed around it. "Thank you." He nodded. That night, they shared cornbread and beans, and when she cleared the dishes, she looked back once before stepping into her room. "Good night, husband," she said. He didn't speak until the door closed behind her. "Good night, Odella," he said, so quiet even the fire barely heard. By mid-September, the days shortened enough that supper had to be started before the sun touched the pines. Odella moved through the kitchen with sleeves pinned back, her apron dusted with flour and salt. A pot of venison stew simmered low on the iron stove, and the scent of bay leaf and onion filled the cabin. Brenner came in with a bloodied cloth wrapped around his left hand. "What happened?" she asked, turning from the stove. "Wire snapped while I was tightening the south gate. Caught me wrong." She crossed the room quickly, not waiting for an invitation. "Sit." He lowered himself onto the bench, his jaw clenched but silent. She unwrapped the cloth, her hands brisk and practiced. "This needs stitching," she said after a moment, already reaching for the tin box near the hearth. "You done that before?" "Too many times," she said. "You'll keep still?" "I can manage." She worked in silence, threading the needle with steady fingers. His blood darkened the towel beneath his hand, but he didn't flinch. When she passed the last stitch and tied it off, her touch lingered just a second longer, thumb brushing the edge of his palm. "You'll need to keep it dry for 3 days," she said, rising to rinse the cloth. "And no lifting anything heavier than a saddlebag." He raised an eyebrow. "You planning to do the hauling now?" She didn't look back. "I've done more with less." That evening, they ate by lamplight. Outside, the wind had settled, and the sky turned the color of embers behind the ridge. Caleb Barnes came by the fence line. Brenner said between bites. "Said he's selling off his eastern pasture. Could be good grazing if we get another cow in the spring." She set her spoon down. "You thinking of buying?" "Maybe. Might be time to grow the stock." Odella leaned back slightly, studying him. "You think we'll be here that long?" He met her gaze without pause. "I do." She didn't reply, but her eyes stayed on him longer than habit would allow. Later that night, she stood outside beneath the stars, her shawl wrapped tight. Brenner joined her, his bandaged hand tucked in the crook of his arm. "You always come out here alone?" he asked. "Only when I need to feel small again," she said. "It helps me forget what I carried before." He stepped beside her, the cold settling in around them. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." "I know," she said, voice quiet. "I just don't know how to set it down." Brenner looked at her, the firelight from the window catching in her hair. "You don't need to all at once," he said. "Just a little at a time." She turned her face up toward the stars, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The next morning, she rose early and took his coat from the peg. She sat by the window with the mending in her lap and stitched a lining into the inside of the sleeve, careful to leave space for his bandaged hand to move without catching. When he came in from the barn, she held it out to him without a word. He slipped it on, flexed his fingers once, then looked up at her. "You added this," he said, brushing the seam. "You need it now," she said simply. He nodded, then stepped closer. "You keep doing things that make it hard not to want more." Her breath caught, but she didn't step back. "Do you?" "I do," he said. "But I'll wait until you want it to." The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was full. She reached up then, fingertips brushing the edge of his collar, and left her hand there. "I think I already do," she said, quiet as dust falling on a windowsill. He rested his forehead against hers. Outside, the frost began to melt from the porch rail, water running in threads down the wood. Inside, the stew pot still warmed on the stove, and the scent of bay leaf lingered in the air like a promise. The last of the autumn yellow clung to the cottonwoods by the creek, stubborn against the wind that carried the scent of snow. Odella stood by the old shed, her shawl drawn close, watching as Brenner adjusted the new gate latch he'd fashioned from scrap iron earlier that week. His stitches had healed clean, though the skin still pulled tight where the wound had closed. "You planning to keep working that latch all morning?" she asked, brows raised just enough to soften the words. "It sticks when it's cold," he said, nudging the hinge again. "I'd rather mend it now than come out in a snowstorm with one hand full of feed and the other fighting frozen iron." She stepped forward, her boots crunching over the brittle ground. "Then let me hold it steady." He handed her the brace without hesitation, and she knelt beside the post. The wind caught the edge of her scarf and tugged it loose. Brenner reached to tuck it back into place, his fingers brushing the skin beneath her ear. She didn't move away. "You mentioned your sister once," she said, eyes still on the hinge. "Where is she now?" "East of Helena. Married a Sawyer. Has 3 boys and a house full of noise and noisemakers. She'd set you talking for hours if she were here. I wouldn't mind some noise now and then." He leaned back on his heels, watching her. "You miss it?" "What? Family?" She paused, the wind rising around them. "I miss knowing someone would call my name from the next room," she said. "Not because they needed something, just because I was there." He didn't answer right away. Then, quiet and certain, he said, "You'll hear your name here. As much as you want." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'd like that." Over the next weeks, their rhythms settled deeper. She began sleeping in the main room more often, not always on the floor, and not always apart. They fit into each other's silences without effort, and into each other's work without needing to ask. When the snows came, they cut deeper trails for the animals, and she learned how to pack the stove's flue so it wouldn't smoke when the wind shifted. One evening, as the wind howled hard enough to rattle the shutters, Odella laid out her sewing for the last time that season. She'd finished lining the inside of Brenner's winter coat and had begun stitching a small square of cloth into a pouch. He watched her from the hearth. "That for you?" "No," she said. "For the child I lost. I never made him anything." Brenner moved closer, pulled his chair beside hers. "What is it?" "A sachet, dried mint and wild chamomile. Something soft to carry." He didn't speak, just rested a hand on her knee, grounding her without word or weight. She finished the final stitch without rushing. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "about what it means to begin again." He looked at her, waiting. "I was never asked what I wanted," she said. "Not when I married before. Not when we buried our child. Everything just kept happening. But this time, I want to choose." "You already have," he said. "You stayed. I want to choose more than that." Her voice was steady now. "I want to build something with you. Not just survive beside you." He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small ring he'd carved from bone and polished smooth. He held it out in his open palm. "I made this a week ago," he said. "Didn't know if I'd get to give it to you. But I hoped." She stared at it for a long moment, then took it and slid it onto her finger. It fit without resistance. "I want it all," she said. "The mornings, the work, the winters. I want to belong here." "You already do," he said. That night, they lay beneath the quilt she'd mended, their hands clasped between them. The wind outside whispered through the trees, but it no longer sounded like something to brace against. By spring, the wildflowers bloomed early, and the fields filled with birdsong. Odella planted a vegetable bed behind the cabin, neat rows of carrots, turnips, and beans. Brenner built a small table for her by the window, where she could write or sew, or simply watch the light stretch across the hills. They rode to town only when needed, and when they did, she walked beside him with her head high, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. No one called her widow anymore. The sheriff tipped his hat without comment, and the shopkeeper remembered her name. By midsummer, they had taken in a stray lamb with a crooked leg and a temperament too stubborn to match its size. Odella named it Finch, and it followed her from pasture to porch without shame. Brenner said little about it, save for the smile he wore when she wasn't looking. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the world turned gold, she sat on the edge of the porch, her feet bare against the warm wood. Brenner joined her, carrying 2 tin cups of dandelion wine they'd bartered for in town. "I've never been this settled," she said, watching the horizon. good settled, or the kind that makes you restless? The kind that makes you breathe easier. He took her hand, pressing it to his chest. Then breathe with me. And she did. They spent their days in labor and laughter, in quiet companionship and the kind of love that doesn't need claiming to feel true. The land didn't soften for them, but it held them, steady and sure, as they carved out a life that was theirs alone. In the years that followed, they added a second barn and a small corral. Odella delivered 2 healthy children, a girl with her father's eyes and a boy with her mother's grit. Finch lived longer than any lamb had a right to, and the bone ring never left her hand. They grew old in the shadow of the ridge, with the same rhythm that had first bound them: work, warmth, and the quiet choosing of one another every day. Always.